The title of this message is Extra Practice. Extra practice or extra effort. Extra practice or extra effort. It's sort of saying the value of doing more than the minimum. The value of doing more than the minimum. Extra practice. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul tells the Corinthian church, and they have a load of problems, people being drunk at the Passover, and just a ton of problems. And in a way, we're grateful for him because he wrote two of the most inspired letters to kind of straighten them out, and apparently he did. He told them they needed to do self-examination before the Passover. They need to take it seriously. And one way to take it seriously is through self-examination. Well, I'm going to flip that 6 months to the fall holy day season, because there are two holy days, well, and actually there are three holy day seasons, but two big ones, spring and fall. And in the fall one, I think we should do self-examination also. But you're going to say, but Paul didn't specifically say that. So I'm not saying Paul required it, or at least if he did, it's not recorded in the epistles, to my knowledge. But a lot of people believe, and you'll see it in much of the literature, that a lot of people, the 10 days before atonement, they spend time in self-examination trying to prepare themselves for the Day of Atonement. Now, I'm going to admit, as far as I know, it's not required in the Bible. But I'm going to ask or suggest that we put out the extra effort, that is, put in the days before atonement, do more self-examination. And since it's they call it the civil year, fall to fall, like the school new year, and a lot of governments do that too. And the Jews call it the new year. We look at the overall big picture from year to year. So in the evaluate things like, well, how did I do this year? That is, 21 to 22. And can I, by analyzing how I did last year, do even better next year? So when I come to atonement next year, I'll have grown closer to Christ. I'll be more like what God wants me to be, as Mr. Polk said in the prayer. In other words, but admittedly, it's not in the Bible. Now, it's in literature, what I call Christian commentaries, to get ready for atonement, but it's not required. But I say, put in that extra effort. And I will give you some thoughts on it. Extra efforts, extra self-examination. It might save us spiritually. You never know. Though there's no such written commandment, it's like you're saying to yourself, I'm going to do more than the minimum because I think it's the smart thing to do. It's the wise thing to do. Someone says, winning more. Let me give you a coach's perspective. A lot of coaches will tell their team, you don't want to get complacent. You do not want to get complacent. Now, Carl and I were talking about, and I may forget the details, but Arkansas was playing Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was one of the, as they often are, one of the top-ranked teams. And Arkansas's, many of their big stars broke a lot of the coach's rules, go into details. To keep discipline on the team, he suspended them and put their backups in. So all the people, including the Oklahoma football team, said, we got it made. We're going to run over these guys. We were going to probably beat them anyway. But now that all their stars are suspended, it's going to be a cakewalk. Oklahoma went in there thinking this is going to be easy. Well, you know what happened? Arkansas ran them out of the stadium. The backups beat them and beat them badly. They got complacent. You know it's easy to get complacent? It really is. You think you got it made, and you relax, and things go wrong. As Carl and I were joking about their local team, I said, losing the first game may be good for them. It keeps you from getting, you win things are too easy for you. you get complacent. And it's easy to do that. Let's take the Laodicean church, for example. Based on the way it's, Christ has given the revelation to the Apostle John, but the way it's written, the Laodicean church thought they were hitting on all 8 cylinders. They were a wonderful church. They were spiritually rich. They could spiritually deep understand. They had great eyes. They had become lukewarm. But God did not say that. God said, no, you become complacent. And that extra time we might spend getting ready for atonement might keep us from getting complacent, or at least it will help. I'll put it that way. Even though there's no written requirement that says you should get ready for atonement, to my knowledge. Revelation 3:14. And to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans, I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. In other words, I wish you were either not converted altogether or you were a strong church. I don't like this lukewarm, we're there, but we're kind of just coasting. So then, because you're lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. That's the New King James. King James doesn't put it quite that bluntly, but you're a disgusting group because you're not fired up. You're not putting in the extra effort. You're coasting. Verse 17, because you say, I am rich, I become wealthy, I have need of nothing. By the way, think of a Christian thinking to himself, God, I have need of nothing. I don't need anything. I mean, we're about as spiritual as we can get. We have need of nothing. Can you think of a worse spiritual attitude to have? We got need of nothing, man. And by the way, and I know some churches that say they're the only Philadelphia church, they're the great church, and all the other branches are bad news. You realize that self-evaluation doesn't mean anything as far as you're labeling yourself spiritual or your organization spiritual. It's what Jesus Christ thinks. It's what Jesus Christ thinks. And I think verse 17 really puts that into context. So if you had asked somebody, and by the way, that was one of the churches that was not started by Paul, but by one of Paul's disciples. We think most of the churches on that mail route were started from that great Ephesians church, which we'll be reading about in the Bible study today. Paul's disciples started that church. They had never seen Paul by face, though he did write them an epistle which did not get preserved, unfortunately. I'd love to see what Paul said to the Laodiceans. But the Laodiceans said, I am rich. They thought they were a great church, but that's not how Christ saw it. And have need of nothing. And you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. In other words, they don't have any spiritual righteous clothes. You can't spiritually see anything. And you're really not that great. And being self-deceived is rich. It's easy to be self-deceived. There are people who, in their arrogance, think they're God's gift to whatever. You see them on TV. They're as wrong as they can be. And someday it'll come out, maybe not now, but it's easy to get arrogant. What a joke, self-deceived. So if we do not want to be self-deceived, I think the more you examine yourself and what you did the past year and maybe the past couple of months, and everybody's got different problems, different issues, so I'm not lumping everybody together. We'll all be unique. By the way, I think God wants unique children in his family who think for themselves. We're not robots. We have free moral agency. God's not going to make you do anything. I mean, he'll push us, encourage us, help us, especially help us. That's what Christ is, our high priest, and atonement's all about Jesus Christ, our high priest. We mentioned in the podcast last night, we asked, well, what percentage of Christians realize that Jesus Christ is our high priest right now and actively there as our advocate sitting on the throne next to the Father in the real Holy of Holies up in heaven? Because what Moses put in the tabernacle and temple was a model of the real thing up there. How many Christians? And after we discussed it, we said, very, very small percentage of the world realizes that Jesus Christ is our high priest right now. So during these days, roughly 10 days from trumpets to atonement, when we lead up to atonement, we should try to deal with our high priest in prayer and talk about self-evaluation, self-awareness, trying to be more like Christ and ask him to help us to see whatever we need to see about ourselves. Because you can deceive yourself into thinking you're better than you are. And I'm not saying that you're bad. I don't mean to imply that. So I'm not saying we're bad. I'm just saying most people, 99%, could do even better. Could do even better. A lot of us could do a lot better, but we certainly could do better. So doing it twice a year is going to be better than only doing it once a year. And atonement's also about the evil influences society has. And the evil influences are lulling us into sleep spiritually. And when you read certain prophecies in the Bible where Christ says, be sure, you'll see it in Matthew 24, that when I come, my servants are not asleep, that I don't catch them totally off guard. I don't read the scriptures, but you know them quite well. Well, what does that imply? That the world, which is for the most part led and deceived by Satan, is trying to lull us to sleep. Satan is saying, go along with the flow. Quit resisting the flow. Go with everybody else. Take it easy. Have another piece of candy. Not that candy's bad, but I'm making a point. Have another piece of candy, some more fried chicken. Relax and go with the flow. Do all the stuff that you know you shouldn't do, but relax. Have fun. Go with the world. I'm not against fun, but some fun isn't good for us. You know what I mean, I think. And atonement is about also locking evil away. But evil has not been locked away yet. It's like people ask, well, why did God allow Satan in the Garden of Eden? He knew Adam and Eve were naive and vulnerable. What can I tell you? God allows us to be tested. We're in Satan's society. We might not understand why God allows it, but he does. And Satan will be whispering as best he can, and maybe through other people as well, go with the flow. Lull us, and maybe it'll depend on your environment, how he will suck you in. So when you're praying to God before atonement, talk to him about the influence of the world, how it may be trying to suck us in. We don't want to be like the Laodiceans. They were spiritually blind. They couldn't see the influences around them. And that, by the way, Laodicea was a rich city and one of the sub-headquarters of the Roman Empire. And living in a relatively wealthy society is a spiritual trap too. They say people in third world countries where Christians are more hungry for food and hungry for the truth because it's harder to get there. Aren't as many Bibles, and prosperity has its downside. You can be spoiled easily. We don't want to be spiritually blind. I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 9. But by the way, there are a number of scriptures like this. I'm only read one, but Paul makes statements like he guards himself lest he become a castaway as well. And you'll find that in the New Testament. And there's several others. I'm only going to read one, but most of you know the kind of verses I'm talking about. Paul did not believe in once saved, always saved. He really didn't. I know people think he did, but he doesn't. A number of places when you read the major epistles, like in the last 3 or 4 chapters of Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and I'm probably forgetting a few of the others. He always has something in there. Be careful, including himself, that you don't want to, after I preach the others, I become a castaway. 1 Corinthians 9:25. 1 Corinthians 9:25. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. By the way, the Olympics started in the Greek world, so they understood this. Actually, they had the Corinthian Games. They had like a sub-Olympics in that city. So they were very familiar with, athletic contests for certain. I think they got like a gold wreath and other things if they won the various Olympic events. Now, they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore, I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. In other words, you're not going to be waving your hands around, beating the air. You know where the bag is. You know what you should be punching against. You know what self-discipline you need. Verse 27, but I discipline my body. That means you have to say no to yourself. You have to say, I don't want to go to church. I'm tired. I want to sleep more. You got to force yourself to get up. I don't want to pray today. I don't feel like it. And we all understand those feelings. You might lie to each other. Oh, I always feel pious. No, you don't. If you're honest, no, you don't. There are times you don't feel like doing the right thing, eating the right things, praying to God, whatever it is you know you ought to do, work in the garden. Maybe that could go either way, but you know what I mean. You got to discipline yourself to get up when you don't want to get up. Get out of bed and do what you ought to do. Isn't that what self-discipline is? You have to say no to yourself. These athletes have trainers. Actually, all the big teams, I believe this is true of all the major sports, baseball, basketball, football, have trainers. And part of the goal of the trainers is they drag the athletes, I think football maybe more than most because their bodies are more at risk. They got to spend so many hours, whatever they do, stretching their muscles, building. Like one guy got drafted, it was in my class as a lineman to a major NFL team. He was about 250 pounds. He's a pretty big, strong guy. The trainers are working him out. They're bulking him up. I know he started some games last year, but they really work those guys. They stretch their muscles. And if you go to some of those gyms, it's really discipline. They say you work the muscle till it burns. Then you rest a day or two. And then by tearing down muscle tissue, then it builds itself back up bigger, bulkier, and stronger. And actually, in some cases, they might overdo it. Some of these guys look too muscular. But maybe that's another discussion. But they have trainers to discipline themselves to work out. Now, I did hear this the other day. This is a thought. Tom Brady is different. He changed his training regimen. He does his own training. He believes instead of bulk, because apparently this was a knock on him when he went to the draft, he's tall and skinny. He's not muscular, not fast. So he wasn't drafted high because he physically is not an impressive specimen. Now, this is what he does. I mean, he's more muscular than he was when he was drafted. He's built on that. But he builds on stretching, flexibility, and he does his own discipline. But let's just assume that all this stuff is true. His self-discipline works for him. He's been playing, 23, 24 years. Last year led the league in passing, and he's almost 46. His self-discipline has worked for him. And his own workout, which is more stretching than muscle building, more self-discipline. Apparently he doesn't eat bread. Not that I'm recommending that, but apparently he has a strict diet. He is a model, at least in the sports world, of self-discipline. Now, I know you're going to say, at his age, one hit by a big 300-pound lineman, he could be hurt and out of the game at any day, any moment. I realize that too. But I think it's a good example of discipline. So isn't that what we're saying to all of us are saying to ourselves? The extra discipline of getting ready for atonement, maybe it isn't required, but it would be a smart thing to do. Just like Tom Brady's taking charge of his own physical fitness, whatever you want to call it, program has worked for him. I don't think anybody has played that position where you get hit a lot, standing up, as long as he has and is still working at top peak performance. I assume he'll retire at the end of this year, probably. You don't want to be playing till you're 50. That might be crazy for a sport that's violent and meant for young men. But Paul says, but I discipline my body. And I think Paul means it, not just his mind, his body. He makes himself do what he's supposed to do. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I should become disqualified. Or some translations say cast away as well. So a little extra discipline is good for her. They say if you're a major musician, like a pianist, the best ones practice and practice and practice, so that when they get on the big stage and they'll be normally nervous, they claim there's such things as muscle memory. I'm not saying I understand it because I've never been a star or anything, but you practice so much that once you get started, your mind, the muscle almost knows how to play that stuff because you self-disciplined your body and you got it. 2 Corinthians 12:5. Now this is a surprising one in one way. Now Paul is actually, he says he's not really defending himself to the Corinthians. He's trying to get the Corinthians to appreciate that he is the true apostle they should be listening to, and they should ignore the false apostles that are leading them astray. And in doing that, he tells them that God took him to heaven, and he heard, apparently he has the gift of speaking the angelic language. He said that in other places. He heard things that he can't even repeat, that he can't even say. He heard wonderful things. One thing we do know, Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament. That tells you he was the most inspired of all the apostles. Even the others say he wrote things deep that you can't understand unless you have a good background in the Bible. Anyway, here's what Paul said, 2 Corinthians 12:5. Of such a one, he's speaking of himself, I will boast. But I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelations. In other words, God gave Paul great revelations. A thorn in the flesh was given to me. Now you're going to ask yourself, why did God give the great Apostle Paul a thorn in the flesh? We think it might have been severe eye headaches that bothered him since he had eye problems, but no one's quite sure, lest he should be exalted above measure. In other words, God said, I'm going to put some extra, if you want to call it, pressure on Paul to keep him humble. If God put extra pressure on the Apostle Paul, would it be bad for us to put extra pressure on ourselves? You see I'm not saying we're great like Paul, but you see the parallel there. Let me give you another example. And by the way, Paul ends up saying after 3 tries, he realized it was the best, and he agreed with God that what God was doing was the best for him. Let me give you the case of David. Unlike Saul and many other kings, God allowed David was crowned while Saul was still king. And then he went to play for Saul. He got to learn how the royal castle works by being there and playing. But you realize for 7 years, more or less, Saul backed off now and then, but most of those 7 years, Saul and the army were after David. He became an outlaw. That was extra pressure on David. And then from 7 years, then Abner and one of Saul's weaker sons, Ishbosheth, had a good chunk of Israel on their side because Abner didn't want to give up the power he had as the commanding general under Saul. That kept David from being the united king of all Israel, though he gained more and more as he won more and more, but still for another 7 years. So for 14 years, or more or less, you could argue a year or two, but for 14 years, God put David under pressure. Do you realize David, by far and away, was the greatest king Israel ever had? And the Bible gives more ink to David than anybody else in the Bible. And Christ came as a descendant of David, but God put David under pressure. God didn't have to do that. He could have knocked Saul off right away, put David in. Abner those guys maybe wouldn't have succeeded in what they did. But God put David under additional pressure, and David became the greatest king Israel ever had. And it's just something to think about. He put tough hurdles in David's way, and it made David a greater king than he otherwise would have been. Sometimes good teachers will push a student to be the best they can be, and they hope it'll be good for them. There are TAC officers and drill instructors in the military that push their cadets and their soldiers to be extra tough. I'm reading, well, this one book, and it may not be true, but the guy attributes his survival in Vietnam to the tough trainer he had. He says, this guy told me never, ever to quit and be tough. And his patrol boat got machine gunned and sunk by the Viet Cong. And he had to hide under the water level several times to hold his breath. But he survived until rescue helicopters came. He said, now this may not be true, people have their own opinions. He said, if it wasn't for that tough coaching I had in high school, I wouldn't have survived. It made me never quit, never ever quit. That was, by the way, Winston Churchill's great slogan, never ever quit. And well, it's an interesting thought. My point is, if teachers train students really well, and that can also include parents and especially mothers and dads, if you can give your kid, matter of fact, they say part of the crime problem is a family problem. Families are not teaching discipline to their kids. And I understand it. I said, yeah, teenagers are wild and crazy. You can teach them stuff and they sometimes go wrong, and good parents are bad kids. I understand that teenagers are free moral agents, so I'm not trying to oversimplify it. But as a generality, if more, they say mothers spoil boys terribly. I'm just telling you what I read. Mothers spoil boys terribly. And and I know this will sound like bragging, so you can tell this thing. I heard good news about our grandkids. They're paying for their own stuff, and one has a full-time job right out of high school. And I was saying, well, we might complain about my daughter-in-law and other stuff, but maybe they've done pretty good with the kids. Now, I could be kidding myself to say, yeah, you just wait and see. So I don't want to jinx them. My point is, though, I really believe this, regardless of any individual. Parents have a lot to do with the discipline and success of their kids' lives. And a lot of times, you don't see it when they're young. But later in life, they remember the stuff that you taught them. And it does come back to help them. Because the world is screwed up because family values are going to pot. What do you bet the devil will continue to have lawyers and laws? Like, there's a law in front of Congress now called the Family Improvement Act. Well, guess what? It does the exact opposite. It undermines marriage. It really does. Anyway, you'll hear the details later. Almost anything certain party in Congress does, whatever title they put on it, like inflation reduction, it's the exact opposite of what they say it is. I guess you call it salesmanship. But parents are really important. So try to coach your kids as best you can and push them a little bit to be self-disciplined. Now, this joke is called Lucky Number 5. Lucky Number 5. A 55-year-old man was born on May 5th. He was married, had 5. After 5 years, he had 5 children. He made $55,555.55. His lucky number was 5. He received a phone call from a friend. He says, well, guess what? The horse that's running is named Lucky 5. And he's running in the 5th race. The guy says, I got to bet on him because 5 is my lucky number. And you guessed it. Lucky 5 came in 5th. By the way, he took out his $5,000 reserve savings and bet it on Lucky 5. But he did come in fifth. You're going to say, what point can you make out of that joke? He took the easy way of analyzing winners, just his lucky number, but that's the easy way. Sometimes taking the easy way is not the best. Taking the easy way is not the best. That extra self-exam will be good for us. Extra hard work, extra hurdles are good for us. Let me use the example of David, another David example. David had the previous year won leading his army, because that's what kings did in those days. They went out in the spring and summer and they fought with their opponents, and that's how kingdoms stayed safe and get bigger anyway. And one of the kingdoms had called some allies to help them, and David and Abner defeated them all. And so the Ammonites ran back into their Libnah, their strongly walled city, and kind of going to hold out there. So when the next spring came, David thought, well, Abner can handle this all by himself. We've defeated them and their allies, so I'm going to stay back in Jerusalem and take it easy. One day he was walking on they had like ceilings the roofs of houses were sort of like our balconies today. He was on the balcony on the roof and he saw Bathsheba bathing. And then he took the second look, which was his big mistake. If he had gone with the army and taken the hard way, he wouldn't have been there, and maybe that wouldn't have happened to him. I know you can say, well, you can't really prove that. But he got complacent, see, because he said, well, the victory is ours. Abner can take that city without my help. And I do see the logic of what he was saying. There is a certain logic to what he was saying. But taking it easy proved a disaster for David. And remember, atonement is not only about the sins of the people being covered by a high priest, it's also about removing evil. So we need to analyze, how is evil influencing us? And remember, our high priest is Jesus. I'm going to go to Hebrews, but if you read the entire chapters from Hebrews 7 through Hebrews 10, the whole focus is on Jesus Christ, our high priest, and fitting it in to the atonement model, because it's clear that's what Paul is talking about. Because he's talking about, in previous chapters, the Holy of Holies, and the priest can only go in there once for himself, but we now have a high priest in heaven, and we can go anytime we want, and our advocate is with us, where the physical high priest could only do it once a year. Hebrews 10:16. Hebrews 10:16. This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I'll put my laws into their hearts, and their minds I will write them. Verse 17. Their sins and their lawless deeds I'll remember no more. So our high priest is there to help us. Now, where there is remission of these, there is no longer an offering for sin. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Christ. In a figurative sense, in prayer, we can go where the high priest only went once a year, and if he messed up, God struck him dead. So, this is a big deal. Only once a year can anyone go in the Holy of Holies. Well, Paul is saying through prayer, we can go to the real Holy of Holies in heaven any time we want to and deal with Christ. So on the next, as you get closer to atonement, the days before atonement, boldly go in prayer to our high priest, how we can do better, repent, talk to Christ about the influence of the evil world, how we should handle it. Work with our high priest daily so we can do better than last year, commit ourselves. And maybe we'll analyze our mistakes from the last year with more clarity. We get less spiritually blind, which will help us not drift downward. And that's what Satan is doing. You can almost see Satan getting people used to stuff that we would have considered perverted a few years ago. They're now having, I'm not making this up, they're having drag queen hours in churches with little kids of kindergarten, 6, 7, 8 year age, dancing on poles. He's making that up. Now we know they have it in libraries and places for public school oh well. I could tell you more bad things, but can you see Satan is getting us used to decadence? He's pulling the world in. I'm still upset seeing, especially two black men kissing on television. It bothers me. But I know people say, you got to get used to it. They have it on TV commercials now. And, well, anyway, I'm going to all that. But they're getting us used to it. And I don't want to get used to it. I'm in a bad attitude. Hebrews 7:22. By so much more, Jesus has become a surety of a better covenant. Also, there are many priests. Verse 25. Therefore, he is also able to save to the uttermost. Christ can save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Verse 26. For such a high priest was fitting for us. In other words, Jesus Christ is not just our lamb and our sacrifice. I know we emphasize that at Pentecost. But atonement, he plays another part of that role. He is our high priest. And that means he's advocating, like our defense lawyer, like Satan, who was our accuser, said, look at them, all the bad sins and whatever problems they got. And Christ, like our defense lawyer, says, I'm on their side, Father. Maybe they're guilty, but you can put this one on me. I mean, their guilt. Because I'm with them. I'm advocating for them. And I'm helping them to fight and resist these evil trends that Satan has cleverly built into their world. And that's what he is. Our high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, has become higher than the heavens. Verse 27, who does not need daily, as those priests, to offer up sacrifices for his own sins and then for the people. Notice, the high priest had to first go through a whole ritual of wearing pure linen and sacrificing for himself and special bathing to even be worthy of representing the Messiah when he went to the Holy of Holies. But Christ is pure always. For this he did once and for all. He offered himself. Jesus is both our lamb and our high priest. And we should talk to him a lot before atonement. Even though it's not required, we should put in that extra effort of talking to Christ before the Day of Atonement.